Well, hello everyone, and welcome to our panel on the history of the verbal behavior SIG. I'd like to thank Andresa and Adrian and Danielle for making this event happen. It's amazing to me that it's 46 years since we started the Verbal Behavior Special Interest Group. I know Skinner would be thrilled to see us still around and to see what we've done. I know he'd be proud of what the Verbal Behavior Special Interest Group has done and proud of us being the steward of what he considered to be his most important work. Now, today we're going to have 5 previous chairs or presidents of the SIG talk about the state of the verbal behavior area when they were chairs, as well as primarily about the accomplishments that were achieved during their time that they served. This will be followed by a question and answer period. And as Adrian had said, if you put your question in the chat box, Adrian will feed it to us and we'll go with it. I hope we get a lot of questions and comments and hopefully things to talk about as we get to the last quarter of our presentation. Before I start my panel presentation, I'd like to give just kind of a brief history of the book Verbal Behavior. It's a story that began. It's a story that began 89 years ago. Skinner first started working on his book Verbal Behavior in 1934, and it was the result of a challenge from the philosopher Alfred North Whitehead. Many of you may know this story, but Skinner was seated next to Alfred North Whitehead at a Harvard Society of Fellows dinner, and they, as he said, dropped into a discussion of behaviorism. And Whitehead said he was willing to concede to the behavioral view, primarily for nonverbal behavior and rats and pigeons and so on. But he said, when it comes to the topic of verbal behavior, something else must be at play. And he said, let me see you account for my behavior as I sit here and say, no black scorpion is falling on this table. And Skinner reports that the next morning he drew up the outline for this present work. It took Skinner 23 years to complete the book Verbal Behavior, but a lot happened in between. Not only did it take a while for Skinner to work out the details of his analysis, but his primary goal was to get the book Behavior of Organisms out. That is, here's the basic principles, here's the data behind a behavioral view of psychology and behavior. Then World War II came along. Eve and Fred had 2 children, Deborah and Julie. After World War II, Skinner had felt that what he really needed to put a focus on was an applied book, how behavior analysis has implications for human behavior. Thus, the book Science and Human Behavior came out in 1953. And in that book, Skinner mentions verbal behavior as his upcoming book. So we see that it did take a while before Skinner finally got Verbal Behavior published in 1957. And what we're going to talk about is what happened after the book was published. What kind of things occurred and what kind of impact did the book have? Well, not much when it first came out. For the first 20 years, it was basically ignored. The book was not well received by both behaviorists as well as linguists. The behavioral community at that time was primarily focused on the experimental analysis of behavior, since most people in the field came to and were attracted to Skinner because of his basic empirical orientation to psychology. That is, most of them were basic researchers, and Skinner's speculation about covert behavior and private events and so on didn't sit well with a lot of the people at the time. Also, there was really no applied field. Applied behavior analysis didn't exist in 1957. It would be 2 more years before Ione and Michael published their Psychiatric Nurses as Behavioral Engineers paper, which basically got the applied field up and running. So we didn't have a population of people that were interested in working with children or working with language delayed people. We also didn't have many people in the field that were interested in language as a subject matter. So the book basically kind of sat there. A few people made use of it, and I'll talk briefly about some of that. But some events occurred that really changed the way things were. And probably one of the biggest events was Jack Michael. Jack began teaching verbal behavior in 1955 at the University of Houston. And as he taught, he gradually began to accumulate a group of students who became more and more interested in that. Also, gradually, the applied field developed, and by the mid-70s, ABA was up and running. Java began in 1968, so we saw our applied field begin to develop. A third event was the Midwestern Association for Behavior Analysis Organization and Conference, which began in 1975. These events kind of all occurred around the same time, around 1975. By 1977, MABA had started the special interest group category. I was on the program committee in 1977, and I helped to organize the SIGs, schedule them, and I was particularly interested in, of course, the verbal behavior special interest group that we were forming at the time. And there was a rumor going around that Skinner would be attending the meeting. And we were very cautious about where we scheduled the verbal behavior special interest group. And I also scheduled the verbal behavior track. So we set up a track, and the track ended with the special interest group meeting on the last day of the conference. So all of these events were occurring simultaneously in the mid-70s. Now, in 1978, Skinner wrote, "Verbal behavior will, I believe, prove to be my most important work." Now, this was a year after we had had our first SIG meeting. But notice in here, we have three descriptive autoclinics of weakness. Will, I believe, prove to be. Does he need to weaken this anymore? My most important work. He could have had an autoclitic of assertion saying verbal behavior is my most important work, or verbal behavior seems to be, certainly is my most important work. But will, I believe, prove to be. What's going on here? And we can see the kind of fragile state of this, that here we are, 1977, 78, and for the last 20 years, almost nothing's happened with the book Verbal Behavior. And that's where we come in. So beginning in 1977, the Verbal Behavior Special Interest Group was formed. Now, you'll note in my first use, I don't have a hyphen between VB and SIG, as you see today. We didn't use that. Perhaps somebody later on will tell us when did that occur and what was the reason for putting the hyphen into VB-Sig. But I'm going to talk about the periods 1977 to 1991. The first meeting was organized and chaired by Scott Wood and Jack Michael at the Blackstone Hotel. Now, many of you may not know Scott Wood. Unfortunately, Scott died young, almost about 20 years ago from cancer. And Scott was a student of Jack's at Arizona State University. Scott was probably Jack's most devoted student to verbal behavior. Scott became an expert in verbal behavior, and in many cases probably knew verbal behavior better than Jack. He was an expert in Skinner, and Scott went on after he graduated from Arizona State University, and he began to teach verbal behavior at Drake University. He helped found that program and began to teach verbal behavior using Jack Michael's objectives, his teaching methodology, and so on. Scott generated a number of students. Probably one that you know of and that is in our audience today was Vince Carbone. who has done a wonderful job of carrying on Scott's work and Jack Michael's work, both of whom were extremely proud of Vince and his work throughout the decades. Scott also was the founder of the Behavior Analyst, the journal, the Behavior Analyst, and which is now Perspective on Behavioral Science, on behavior science. So Scott played a major role in behavior analysis for several decades before he passed away. Now here's Scott and Jack at Arizona State University. Now I know you're looking at this and going, it's Sonny Bono and Wolverine here in the mid 60s, and they're certainly having fun here together. As we look at Jack, he's got his mutton chops, and here's Jack in 1975. He still has his mutton chops. He liked those. He said he thought they made him look tough, and students took him more seriously when he looked a little mean. And we ended up. This is the Blackstone Hotel, and any of you who were there at this conference, and I'm sure there's got to be somebody in this audience that was there. The Blackstone was kind of a dump. It was a kind of rundown hotel, but the reason we went there was the Blackstone was across the street from the Chicago Hilton, and the Midwest Psychological Association was having its annual meeting across the street, and the first MABA was planned in order to compete with that. There were several members of MABA that were very upset with the Midwestern Psychological Association. Roger Ulrich, Nate Azrin, Neil Kent. These were some of our founding people. They felt that the Midwestern Association had done them wrong. They weren't accepting behavioral papers. When they did accept the papers, they would give them bad times, 8 o'clock in the morning or the last talk of the conference. And so they decided we're going to have our own conference, and we're going to put it right across the street from their conference. And they did. And we did that for several years. And we did go across the street, I remember, and go to a few talks across the street. But we had our own conference, and that was totally by design. But again, we endured the Blackstone for the first three years, from 1975 to 1977. The yellow walls were a little numbing, though. Here's Scott and Jack again, and Jack, this is still in Jack's mutton chop days, so I'm saying we're probably 73, 74. Scott's now a little hipper looking. He's moved into the 70s, got a beard and such. But Fred Keller played a major role in both behavior analysis, education in so many ways. But in relation to verbal behavior, Jack and Fred were good friends. Fred Keller taught at Western Michigan University for 5 years. And this is most likely in that time period when Fred was teaching at Western, or potentially was maybe a year after he retired from Western. But as I said, Jack and Fred were really good friends, and Jack was very interested in Fred's work on personalized systems of instruction. And Fred helped Jack design and create his courses. And ultimately, Jack developed his own college teaching methodology, which was kind of a refinement of the Keller method: objectives, exams, weekly units, mastery criteria, all of that kind of content. Because as I'll mention soon, verbal behavior is not an easy book, and Jack's goal was to develop it and to make it understandable for students and so on. Interesting enough, Ted Ione, in his eulogy to Jack, had pointed out that Jack was a terrible teacher in his early days, that he didn't interact with students, that he would walk out of his lectures right after he finished talking without talking to anybody, and so on. And he had that kind of reputation in the late 1950s and early 60s. And I'd like to say that Fred Keller kind of softened Jack up in many ways. Here's Skinner and Keller together at the Blackstone in 1977. Now they both came to the conference that year. This photo was taken by Randy Williams, and I thank Randy for giving me permission to show it to you all today. Fred Randy titled this The Two Freds. And as we look at these photos, here's really our four founding fathers, Scott Wood, Jack Michael, and of course, we're working with Skinner's book, Verbal Behavior, but Fred Keller taught us how to teach, taught us how to impart the content from verbal behavior to our students and to other professional individuals, to other fields like speech pathology and linguistics. So it's their shoulders that we stand on now, decades later. Now Jack went through his hippie phase, so the mutton chops are gone, and I'm guessing now we're hitting about 76, 77. Note these collars. I mean, it's like a Miami Dolphins pennant here. But hey, those were really cool. Everybody had these massive collars in the 70s and long hair. And there I am with my long hair. I'm just trying to look like Jack here. You know, it's my long hair. I got my big collars, and I'm definitely wearing my best shirt that I got at the time. This was back in the Blackstone with the yellow walls, if it were black and white. But I'm doing a workshop here with Jack and Norm Peterson on verbal behavior. And in this workshop, one thing I'd like to mention is that Norm Peterson was probably one of the strongest students on Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior. He was Jack's teaching assistant. When I took verbal behavior in 1974, Norm Peterson was the teaching assistant, his graduate assistant at the time. And Norm mentored me in so many ways. I would say I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for Norm Peterson, who really taught me a lot about verbal behavior. You could say that Jack explained Skinner and Norm explained Jack. And so we would go and say, what the heck is Jack talking about? And Norm would say, calm down. Okay, here's what the establishing operation, da 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 da. And he did that for quite a while. Norm was Jack's first PhD student to graduate. And at this workshop, some of the things that we talked about was Norm's effort to teach verbal behavior in its basic components. Jack often talked about the problem with Skinner's book. One of the many problems he found with Skinner's book was he blended the basic analytical system with hundreds and hundreds of interpretive examples, both useful, but what happened was it took 300 pages to get to the autoclitic, and you need that component of the analysis early on. And Norm did his doctoral dissertation on a concept analysis of 44 basic terms and concepts within verbal behavior, and that became his book, An Introduction to Verbal Behavior. I was the applied guy, and basically worked on, in this presentation, I'm giving the application of Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior to assessment and intervention. I ended up being Jack's second doctoral student to graduate from Western. And again, I attribute much of that to Norm. Here we are, I think, in 1979. Jack's got his leather jacket on phase. So we're kind of moving into the disco time period. I think we're already there. And you can see Scott and Jack are goofing around. And this is obviously a more mature Scott. I'd guess he's about 40 here. Jack must be about 53, 54. In this photo. This is not at the Blackstone. I'm guessing this is in Dearborn, and I'm pretty sure this is the Verbal Behavior SIG meeting. Jack and Scott were chair of the special interest group for the first 4 years, and I'll give you some detail on that shortly. Well, so what was going on in this first meeting? And 1977 was the 20th anniversary of verbal behavior, the publication of the book. So there was a lot of discussion. We were going to do several things with the verbal behavior track this year. We had a lot of good presentations, but we also were now going to introduce the special interest group for our members. However, it was not a happy time. 20 years after the publication, the book was hardly used. People were not really pleased with many behavior analysts response to verbal behavior. They basically ignored it. We struggled to get the applied field, to get Java involved in verbal behavior, but uh, at that time, we had no published lines of empirical research on verbal behavior. One of the biggest issues about the book that was raised was that Skinner published the book without any graphs, no data, no confirmation that the mand and the tact and the interverbal are empirically separate from each other. And he took a lot of heat for that. There were I specifically remember people like Og Lindsley was so upset that there were no 6-cycle logs charts in the book. There could have been data here. There could have been data here. And he was not happy with that. But there were a lot of others that weren't. I mean, as we progress through today, we're going to look at the empirical lines of research we have today on verbal behavior, and we have a number of really detailed lines of thematic research that are really working out the issues of things. And on our panel today with the work that April Kisamore is doing, and Judah Axe, and people in the audience, Kyle Miguel, you look at the thematic research that's going on in the area of generative learning now, for example. Well, we didn't have any of that in the 70s. We didn't even have published data that showed the mand was different from the tact. And that was the first of the thematic lines of research that Jack set us off on in his verbal behavior lab that I'll talk about briefly soon. Well, Java and JAB really weren't interested in publishing verbal behavior papers. We couldn't get them in there. Java felt it was too translational, too experimental, and their editors were not real verbal behavior people, and we really got nowhere with that group. JAB was kind of responding, it was too applied. They weren't interested in verbal behavior. They published some conceptual papers and so on, but not many verbal behavior papers, maybe 1 or 2 or 3 here and there. A bigger problem was we really didn't have a research methodology. How do you study language's behavior? The traditional methodology for applied behavior analysis simply didn't work. Like, for example, our work on automatic reinforcement in the 70s looked nothing like a Java paper. Our graphs were sometimes 10 minutes of data, and they were cumulative records, and we couldn't really put them in a standard Java design, and so that didn't work. It's interesting to note in the recently released paper in the Verbal Behavior Journal, one of the online versions by Oliveira, Cox, and Petersdotter on convergent multiple control and selection-based verbal behavior. The last sentence in that paper says that something like the methodology that's used in this paper can provide a research methodology for the study of multiple control. So here we are, 64 years later, at 66 years later, 64, and we're still trying to identify methodology to study verbal behavior. It's complicated. Some of you may be familiar with the work of Willard Day. In the 1960s, Willard Day used to just hammer what he called traditional research methodology is constraining behavior analysis. We've got to break free from that. And if you ever seen Willard talk, he's very dramatic. And he published a paper in his journal, Behaviorism, on what he called radical methodology. And so this was a big issue at the time. How do we study verbal behavior? What kind of methodology is available to us? There weren't many applications 20 years after the book came out. Aside from the work of Joe Spradlin. Now, Joe Spradlin was absolutely, I believe, the first person to see the applied implications of Skinner's book, Verbal Behavior. In 1963, 6 years after the book came out, Spradlin published his Parsons language sample, which was a language assessment tool that assessed language as a man, tact, and interverbal. That formed the basis for our ABALs, and the VB map that you see today would not exist if it wasn't for Joe Spradlin and the Parsons language sample and the work that he did on early man training and language training, again, in the early 1960s. But as far as other applications, they were pretty much absent from the behavioral literature, especially Java. And if we look at the teaching of verbal behavior, there are only a few courses around the country. Jack Michael was teaching it, Scott Wood, Ernie Vargas, Willard Day. There was a handful of courses that were available in verbal behavior, but it just simply was not being included in behavior analysis programs. Now, here's another little piece of data. At the first MABA convention, 1975, there was only one talk on verbal behavior. Out of 294 presentations, I counted them, on verbal behavior, the talk was by Joe Pear. So we look at that, and as we progress through today and look at what's going on today, it definitely has changed. Then we have this problem. I had said the linguists weren't all happy with verbal behavior, and it seemed like everywhere we go, there was Noam Chomsky. He was just everywhere. That he started the cognitive revolution. That he had put down behaviorism. He had made it clear all the errors that we had made, and so on. Chomsky, Chomsky, Chomsky. Jack taught a course in cognitive psychology and used Ulrich Neisser's book titled Cognitive Psychology. In the book, he writes, Chomsky's 32-page review of verbal behavior is far more than effective refutation of the behavioristic approach to language. And that's it. No need to read the book, and that's what happened. The linguist didn't, I want to say, give a shit about verbal behavior. And I see Bob Delawi is in the audience. And Bob and I went to graduate school together at Western Michigan University, and Bob was in the linguistics department and I in the psychology department. I think Bob was probably one of the only people in the linguistics department that appreciated verbal behavior. And as we can see, here's Bob today in our audience and still participating in the verbal behavior area. It took some time for linguistics and behavior analysis to come together on some things. I think the area of speech pathology has been the bridge between those two fields because it works, and speech pathologists find the analysis very valuable. Well, what happened? Verbal behavior went out of print after its first run of 3,000 copies. And the Appleton or American Century Crofts sold the rights to Prentice Hall, and it went out of print again. Here's the Appleton Century Crofts version. Now, when I took verbal behavior in '74, I was able to buy this book brand new from the bookstore. So it was one of the first 3,000 copies. After 20 years, that's all that we're using it. Here's the Prentice Hall version, which went out of print again. And if it weren't for the B.F. Skinner Foundation, we would not have Skinner's book, Verbal Behavior. Here is the new extended edition with a wonderful intro by Dave Palmer and the notes that Skinner made in terms of corrections and things that he would change. That in Skinner's book, in his own personal book, he wrote in the margins, and he wrote on the blank pages at the beginning and the end of the book changes that he would make in the book, and those are all included in this enhanced version. So we still have verbal behavior, but there were some rough times in the 70s when it went out of print, and they were struggling to find a new printer. Well, let's go now to the Blackstone. If we look at the program book, we scheduled the meeting from 10 to 2 on Tuesday afternoon, the last morning and afternoon. Now, Jack wanted 4 hours because he thought this was going to be a really good working meeting. And I think he thought he'd lay out his objectives. I'm not sure, but he wanted 4 hours to do this meeting. We ended up doing it in about 2 hours. And the title of it was Teachers Teaching Courses Using B.F. Skinner's book, Verbal Behavior, or those who would like to. So the initial goal was to get people to teach courses in verbal behavior. That's what Jack wanted. Now, Scott Wood is listed as the chair. Jack stood up front with Scott the whole time, and he did that with me too. When I was the chair, Jack would be standing up there with me the whole time. Skinner did attend the meeting, along with at least 200 others. The room was packed, and it was very exciting. It turned out like we had sort of hoped it to be. And Skinner talked several times. And one of the things that Skinner talked about was his difficulty in teaching from the book Verbal Behavior. He had noted it was a complete failure, that the students didn't understand the book, that one semester just wasn't enough. And so the discussion kind of went on of how can we teach verbal behavior in a better way, a more efficient way. And again, that's where Norm Peterson's book turned out to be a very critical element in all this. About 20 years later, in my last editorial from the analysis of verbal behavior and discussion of this first meeting, I wrote, the consensus of the group was that every effort should be made to improve the instructional technology, foster the exchange of materials, and promote research in the verbal behavior area. Now, the instructional technology was clearly an issue, and as I mentioned, Norm's book and Jack's teaching objectives and so on. But the fostering the exchange of materials, in the mid-70s, we didn't have PDFs, we didn't have the internet, we didn't even have photocopiers, we had ditto machines. There was no way to easily pass out materials to people around the country or around the world. And that was one problem we focused on. The other was in this issue of research, with there being no research or a very limited amount of research supporting Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior. That became a focus of the special interest group. We needed to get people presenting on verbal behavior at the MABA conference. We needed to get people to do verbal behavior theses and verbal behavior dissertations. Here's a listing, and I put this list together just thinking, who are the people that I learned from? Who was teaching us about verbal behavior in the mid-1970s? And as I scroll down this list, all of these people have publications in the literature on verbal behavior. They were presenting at the conferences. They were the people that we learned verbal behavior from. And many of these people were in that meeting. And you look at just like, for example, Charlie Catania has a great paper on the form and function that's published in Willard Day's journal, Behaviorism. So many of these people had published in behaviorism. Ken McCorkadale published two very important papers in JAB. As many of you know, he provided that first response to Chomsky in 1970. The list goes on: Joe Pear, Mark Rochelle, Roger Schneider, Kurt Salzinger, Eve Siegel, Howard Sloan, Joe Spradlin, Ernie and Julie Vargas, and Scott Wood. So, and I'm sure there are many others that go on the list. These are the people that struck me as probably being the most significant to me learning verbal behavior and the peers that I was around at the time. Here's Jack and Skinner, and Jack maintained a pretty regular contact with Skinner. He would call him and ask him questions. They loved to argue, and I'm sure here they're arguing about the establishing operation. That was one of the biggest topics that Jack was determined to get Skinner to appreciate. It's so much better than deprivation, satiation, and aversive stimulation. And Skinner did agree, although he never used it in any of his writings, but there weren't many writings on the topic after Jack's 1982 paper came out. Let's look at the chairs then from the program book from the very beginning of ABA, or the VB-Sig. As I had mentioned, the first chair was Scott Wood, and Jack, I just put with Jack Michael because he was there up front. And it was, the title was Teachers Teaching Courses Using Verbal Behavior, Those Who Would Like to. 1978 was a replication of 1977. They did that again. 1979, Jack was now listed as the first author here, and the title had now changed, VB-Sig Special Interest Group, Teachers of Verbal Behavior. In 1980, they added me as a co-chair, and what I had brought to the group was the application of verbal behavior. That is, applying verbal behavior, language assessment, language intervention to the deaf population, to cerebral palsy and symbol systems, pointing systems, electric switches, everything that we could do to generate man tact and interverbal behavior. I also was the coordinator of Jack's verbal behavior research lab. And so by 1980, we had run about 50 verbal behavior research projects at the Kalamazoo Valley Multi-Handicap Center, primarily due to Jerry Shook allowing Jack to set up a lab there. Brian Iwata had his research lab also at KVMC. We were a practicum site for Western Michigan University, and so we were very research oriented. Of our 50 research projects in 1980, not a single one of them were published. There was no place to publish them, but we now had data on the man versus the tact. That was Janae Hall's master's thesis that we ultimately published in 1987. The tact versus the intraverbal, that was Steve Brahm's thesis that ultimately was published in 1982 with Al Poling. After 1980, then I was a chair. Apparently, I was being groomed to take over by these guys because ultimately they dropped out and left me alone. That was to 84. Now, if we look at from 1985 to 1991, there I am. Except 1987. I don't remember why Jack was listed on the program book. Maybe he thought I needed a refresher course in how to run the SIG. But I still recall in all of these times, Jack always stood up front with me and had plenty to say at these meetings. Now let's just kind of end with the accomplishments of the SIG. We started the monograph series was the first thing that we had done. And that is, I modeled that really after University of Kansas had a monograph series. And they were all publishing Java kind of content. And I thought, well, we can do the same thing at Western Michigan University. We're going to have a verbal behavior one. And we published a lot of the assessment, intervention, the materials on early applications, and also the verbal behavior research projects. My first draft of the ABALs and the VB map was in this monograph series. The teaching language to children with autism, we put in this monograph series in the 70s. Marge Vaughn had her automatic reinforcement papers as a monograph before they became Vaughn and Michael. Jack had instructed me, told me to contact Skinner and ask him about the William James lectures and Hefferline notes and see if we could photocopy and publish those and sell them for cost. And Skinner gave us permission. And this was my first version of it, the Hefferline notes and William James lectures. But I have down on here that it's from the Verbal Behavior Special Interest Group. So in the name of the SIG, we made these materials available to people. And this was part of our addressing the issue of getting materials out. We still didn't have a journal that liked us. Jack made his verbal behavior course objectives and his refinements of verbal behavior available for free. Jack would pay for postage and such. Norm had published his Intro to Verbal Behavior book. We now had a way to teach students the basic concepts from verbal behavior before they started reading Skinner's book. And Jack began to go through Norm's book for the first 2 weeks of his verbal behavior class before he would start teaching from the book. In 1982, we started the newsletter, the VB News. Kent Johnson and I were the first editors of that. Very soon, we started getting a flood of papers. We had a 4-page limitation on our newsletter, and we were getting 30, 40, 50-page papers from people. And we decided to start a journal, and thus the analysis of verbal behavior was born. Officially kind of in 1985, but we used the content from 82 because it was very relevant, like Jack's codic and duplicate paper needed to be in the journal. Joe Spradlin and I served as editors of that first issue, and then I was the editor until 1997 when I turned the journal over to ABA. That was a great day. Another thing we did a lot was promoted research and participation in conferences. Jack was really hammering people. He was out there. Here's Jack and Ivar Lovas and myself. This is our paper on automatic reinforcement. And I kind of refer to this as Ivar isn't buying it. I'm doing my best to argue for automatic reinforcement. I know I got Jack as a wingman, And I'm kind of going, okay, Jack, anytime now. And Jack did jump in and spent about 15 minutes arguing with Ivar about automatic reinforcement. And lo and behold, in Ivar's 1988 paper on self-stimulation, he attributed some aspects of self-stimulation to automatic reinforcement and cited Vaughan and Michael on that. So that's a victory for us. We also, again, this issue of research just constantly bothered us. And we knew there was tons of research that could occur, and that's what led me to do this paper, 301 research topics from Skinner's book. We were getting, people were saying there's no data yet on verbal behaviors. There aren't any yet. There probably never will be. Verbal behavior just isn't leading to research. And we're like going, yes, yes, it is. And so this was designed to say it's not a problem of research and research topics. There just aren't enough researchers doing work in this area. After me was Libby Street for 2 years. Libby did it. Phil Chase did a year after that. Janae Hall for 2 years. Sam Leegland the next couple of years. And then leading up to our next speaker, Bill Potter. Now, I remember when Bill came on, we were so high-tech deficient. We really didn't understand computers. We weren't making any use of listservs. We weren't doing anything. Well, Bill Potter brought us into the computer era. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Bill. I thank you. And Bill, I'm going to mute my mic. And if I could do this right, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.